I can hear you, yes I can. Can you hear me and see me? Yes?
Yes.
Good.
So let me introduce our session chair. The Professor Dr. Shamsad Mortuza is an academic educator, poet, translator and columnist. He is Professor of English at the University. Can you hear me?
Yes, you just froze for a moment.
Okay. So that is the Vice Chancellor of University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. From 2018 to 2022, Dr. Mortuza has previously taught at many universities, including Jamia University. He attended the University of Arizona as a Fulbright scholar. English from Wilbeck College and University as a Fulbright scholar. He received his PhD in English from Wilbeck College. On the figure of the contemporary British poetry. In 2013, he went to the University of California, Los Angeles as a senior Fulbright scholar. He has 6 books and 30 articles. So now I'm giving my microphone to my professor, Mr. Dr. Shamsad Mortuza. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the keynote session on the importance of studying translation. So the conference is addressing one of the most dynamic fields in literary and cultural studies, one that serves as a bridge across languages, histories, and cultures. It allows us to access words and experiences beyond our own, expanding our understanding and empathy in ways few other disciplines can achieve. Today, we are greatly honored to have as our keynote speaker, Professor Susan Bassnett, one of the most respected figures in the field of translation studies. Professor Bassnett's institution has shaping a very new translation, especially regarding its role in the post-colonial world, which is not beginning identity and how the representation is necessary within range of this. Dr. Bassnett, among others, has shown us translation, as many of us know, not just the act of transferring words from one language to another. It's a key integrative process that carries out culture and humanity. This brings us to the age-old debate around divinity. How much is lost? What happened when it takes the process as it has not been very said, translation are being made. Integrating in a bigger gas than yet here, improving practices. As far as challenging and speed, translation is always the art of form. That means what's the one translation
ভিডিও করতেছে না, অনেক সরতে কও, ওইখানে পিছন থেকে সরতে কও, কথা বুঝো না। পিছনে যাবে।
Has expanded our understanding of how translation operates within and across cultural boundaries. Professor Bassnett's insights have been defined utility and shape how we view the translation process. She is a professor emerita of the University of Warwick and also professor at the School of Modern Language and Culture at the University of Glasgow. She is a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature, FRSL, and fellow of the Institute Linguistics, FIL. So please join me in welcoming Professor Susan Bassnett to the virtual stage as she shares her keynote address, titled The Importance of Studying Translation. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I want to thank the organizers, particularly Dr. Mahbub and Mr. Saeed Hussain, who's kept me posted all the way through with what's going on. I'm so sorry I can't actually be there physically. I'm grateful though that we have this Zoom possibility, which does enable us to make contact across worlds. It is something that actually facilitates translation enormously. I wanted to begin with, you must interrupt, by the way, and tell me if I can't be heard. If I disappear temporarily or if I can't be heard, please, someone interrupt. I wanted to begin, really, for those of you who may have come across my work but don't actually know who I am. I wanted to begin with just a few remarks about how I came to the study of translation and comparative literature. Because I think that one's individual pathway in academia is important. In my case, I grew up, I was educated in different countries. I came to England in my mid-teens, and so that gave me a kind of interesting take, if you like, on what it feels like to both belong to a particular culture and not belong. I see myself as having both an inside and an outside perspective, which has been enormously useful. And having always had a second language in my head, albeit the language that changed, and my principal language is Italian, I became aware very, very early on that you can say things, do things, think things in one language that you can't in another. And there is always, if you like, a process of negotiation within one's head. And I'm sure that all of you listening to me now are bilingual, trilingual, in some cases quadrilingual. So you do know what I'm actually talking about. And when I began my formal studies, I did degrees in English and Italian, I was struck by the coincidences, by what is called connections. And I think the word connection is enormously important. It's important in all forms of scholarship, but it's particularly important for those of us who work in literary studies and in translation. Connections, and I would add to that another key word, patterns. They're not particularly scholarly words, but they're enormously important. Connections. I want to just quote something from a useful book that came out in 2015 by Cesar Dominguez, Ronsosi, and Dario Villanueva, Comparative Literature, New Trends and Applications. Because what they have to say is this: a reader tries to make sense of the use of what he or she is reading, creates some kind of form, which is made up of the fabric of words as rewoven in his or her mental encyclopedia. Within this mental encyclopedia, connections are made. Connections consisting of comparisons across languages, time, space, cultures, arts, discourses. By comparing, we build sense. For comparison is a cognitive operation, and a connection between at least two elements transforms both elements. A literary comparison is therefore reading a work through other works, and reading those other works through the work one has at hand. And I like this because I like the idea of something called a mental encyclopedia. Because we all have our own mental encyclopedias. We're all the product of different life experiences, and different intellectual experiences. No two people will ever have exactly the same experiences, and so they're likely to make different kinds of connection. And when we apply this to translation, of course, we can see that no two translators are going to produce exactly the same version. Now, when I make this point to my students, if I'm doing a seminar, I like to give them an example which I think is particularly apposite in a post-colonial context. Most of you, I'm sure all of you, are familiar with the infamous Indian Minute Lord Macaulay from 1835, in which he declared that a single shelf of a good European library is worth all the whole native literature of India and Arabia, and then went on to deride non-European philosophy, history, and science. When I give this to my students, of course, they're terribly shocked, but there it was. But some of you may not be so familiar with the counter-argument put forward by Sri Aurobindo in 1972 in a book called The Foundations of Indian Culture. And I like this quote because he imagined a different approach to European literature from the perspective of a culture that saw itself in the superior position. Imagine, he's saying, if Europe had been colonized by another power that looked at the products of European culture and who might, such a culture might, quote, dismiss the Iliad as a crude and empty, semi-savage and primitive epos. Dante's great work as a nightmare of cruel and superstitious religious fantasy. Shakespeare as a drunken barbarian of considerable genius but with an epileptic imagination. The whole drama of Greece and Spain and England as a mass of bad ethics and violent horrors. And of course we can see that here Sri Aurobindo is being ironic, but he's making an important point. The point is we are shaped by the contexts in which we operate, and we are influenced, whether we recognize it or not, by the norms and ideologies of those contexts. Now, comparative literature as a field of study is currently undergoing a sort of revival, and I'm going to argue that this is due to the rising importance of translation. Aha, I see the tea has arrived. I may take a tea break myself at a certain point with your permission. Back in 2012, Gayatri Spivak wrote a polemical book, some of you I'm sure are familiar with this, Death of a Discipline, that actually called for a new approach to comparative literature. And Spivak's book was one of a long line of negative polemics about comparative literature. Read the famous essay by René Wellick in 1959, The Crisis of Comparative Literature. René Etienne, the French scholar, in 1967 wrote, Comparaison n'est pas raison. Comparison is not reason. And accusations against comparative literature have involved being too Eurocentric, marginalizing minority languages and literatures, failing to distinguish itself from world literature. But in 2017, the American Comparative Literature Association produced a report entitled simply The State of the Discipline. And in her introduction, Ursula Heist argued that there have been positive developments in the 21st century in comparative literature. These include continued interest in literary theory, post-colonial theory, world literature, with its emphasis, and this is important about world literature, the emphasis on the agencies involved in the cross-cultural migration of texts. And I would add the fourth, and probably the most important, translation. Translation and the study of translation has become, I think, a vital element in literary studies. And I would suggest that it is reinvigorating comparative literature, the study of comparative literature. Now, translation studies is a relatively recent field. It began in the 1970s, and I can say this with absolute confidence because the little group of international scholars who met in Belgium and the Netherlands in the 1970s. I was one of them. And the term translation studies was invented by one of the founders, the American poet and translator. Important to remember that of that little group that met, we were all not just talking about translation, we were doing translations. We were translating. And I would argue that the connection, there needs to be a connection when we talk about translation between the actual act of translating. Through the practice, one understands so much more than looking at it in the abstract. The aim of translation studies, very clear aims, to raise the profile and status of translation through the systematic study of how, when, and where translations take place. We all know that translation involves the transfer of something from one language to another, but the moment we start to look more closely at that process, we can see that something more than the linguistic is involved. For example, we know only too well, not all languages claim the same power and status. Literary and cultural history show us this. We look at the dominance of English in the world today and consider the gap between translations into English and out of English. Michael Cronin, one of the leading scholars of translation today, and a very good translator, he wrote in his book, he wrote a book on translation in Ireland in 1996, and has this to say: if political relationships in Europe have been characterized over the centuries by asymmetry, languages have been both accomplices and victims. Translation relationships between minority and majority languages are rarely ever divorced from issues of power and identity. And this, of course, is something that translation studies has brought about. We think more today about the, let's say, not just the inequality of power relationships between languages, but we think much more in terms of the whole ideological framework behind translations. It's also important to remember that translators are not creatures from another planet. They are individuals with their own opinions, and every translation is effectively one reader's, one translator's interpretation of a text. James Holmes said, he used the adjective perverse. It's perverse, said James, to even think that you could have exact equivalence between languages. And he also pointed out that if you give us the same text to a group of different translators, they'll all produce slightly different versions. And yet, a great many people have only minimal understanding of the complexities of translation. And all too often those who do have some acquaintance with other languages have what I call an ambiguous attitude to the translation of the literature, which is of course reflected in a discourse, a continued discourse of negativity. Uncertainty about how to assess the quality of a translation leads to some people saying, well, a translation should perfectly reproduce an original. Failure to do this would be seen as unfaithfulness or betrayal. But as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, perfect reproduction is a myth. And so one of the very first tasks of translation studies as it began to develop through the 1980s was to attack the notion that there could ever be exact equivalence between linguistic systems, let alone between linguistic and cultural systems. There is not, there never can be, a perfect, definitive translation, not only because of the variations between translators, but because the criteria for perfection, the aesthetic criteria that prevail at different points in time, are endlessly variable, constantly changing. And we can see this in the way in which some texts, I've been asked to write an essay on retranslations, and this is a very interesting area, because as you find that retranslations show up very clearly the point I'm trying to make, that aesthetic criteria differ. Aesthetic and ideological criteria differ enormously over time. I think one of the best examples that I give my students is Dr. Johnson, who declared that Pope's Homer was absolutely unrivaled, it was absolutely magnificent, and yet 50 years later it was being dismissed as belonging to a complete, because of course it was done in heroic couplets. And the moment the vote for heroic couplets disappeared, nobody wanted to read anything written in heroic couplets, and it was judged a very long way away from Dr. Johnson's point about its perfection. And the other thing that translation studies has given us is the need to think that there are other agents besides the translator involved in the production and dissemination of translation. Publishing houses, funding bodies, advertisers, in earlier times patrons of the arts, not to mention censors who would vet translations to ensure that nothing untoward, the wrong kind of material was not being imported. I mean, early translations of the novels of Emile Zola, for example, were heavily censored to take out passages that were deemed immoral for Victorian readers. One of my students, my former PhD students, who's now a distinguished professor in his own right, Professor Christopher Rundle, he has become an expert on the history of translation, and in particular, he did his PhD with me on the difference in terms of censorship between dubbing and subtitling, a field that had received only minimal attention. But actually, one of the things I pointed out to him was that I said, somebody needs to do some research on, let's look at Europe, where did the dubbing industry in film develop? And the answer, when you start to look, is it developed under totalitarian regimes in fascist Italy, in Nazi Germany, in Spain under Franco. And why? Well, the answer again is perfectly simple, because if you dub something, then none of the viewers have any access to the source text. Whereas if you have subtitles, you can read the subtitle, and if you have two languages, you can actually see or hear what's going on. So there's an ideological component to dubbing and subtitling, which has everything to do with censorship at certain moments in time. And of course, one basic issue for readers of translation is that we have to take translations on trust. Trust, I think, is a very important word here, because if we want to read something written in a language that we don't know, the only thing we can do is to read a translation. And I think it's no wonder that over time, over the centuries, translators have been criticized, sometimes attacked as untrustworthy. Sometimes translators have been censored and generally persecuted. The history of Bible translation, for example, is a history full of horror stories. Jan Hus and William Tyndale burned at the stake. The translator, the Japanese translator, I mean, it's not just in earlier times. We can find examples in 1991, the Japanese translator of Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was murdered. When I say we, I'm talking about people in general. We are uncomfortable about translation because it requires trust. And to what extent are we willing to trust? Think of the role of translators in war zones, for example, and think of the situation with people because I'm including interpreters when I talk about translators here. The need to trust the translator is essential, and yet at the same time, it relies on us handing over, in a sense, to the translator and believing in the translator. And that's something that many people are unwilling to do. I'm always being asked, for example, by people who have nothing to do with translation. One of my neighbours asked me not long ago, I've just read this terrific book. It's by the woman Olga Tokarczuk, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But how do I know that I'm reading what she wrote? To which I could only say, well, you don't. You just got to trust this. You just got to trust the translator. She won the Nobel Prize. Indeed, all Nobel Prize winners win because their works are translated into a whole range of languages. But I thought it was an interesting question from someone not involved in translation. How do I know I'm reading the same text? Well, of course, in many ways, you're not. You're reading a version, an interpretation. Now, as the new field of translation studies began to grow, it followed a pattern that I think in academic life we've become familiar with. As happened with other subjects emerging in the late 70s and 1980s, such as post-colonial studies, women and gender studies, cultural studies, one important line of research was the historical. The feminist slogan of the day, hidden from history, was actually important and can be equally applied to translation. Michael Cronin's Translating Ireland, I've already mentioned. We can think of Lawrence Venuti's The Translator's Invisibility, a history of translation, where Venuti claimed, I think quite rightly, that translators had so often been ignored that they virtually, although their contribution was enormous, they'd been more or less written out. We don't know their names in most cases. Research into the history of translations is still important. I think it's still an important area for scholars and for PhD students because it can change our ideas about, basically, change our ideas in relation to national literary histories. How many literatures have evolved in isolation is the question to ask. An enormous number, I mean, English literature, think of English literature, which was so hugely reliant on translations for centuries, not only in the early to late Middle Ages, but through the Renaissance, the 17th century, the 18th century. And when we're thinking about translation, we might also want to think that although English has been exporting its literature for some time now, there are enormous numbers of texts that are imported into English, texts that I suppose we would call popular literature. We might want to think of detective fiction. In the last few years, the rise of Scandinavian, Nordic noir, Danish, Swedish, Icelandic, Norwegian, Finnish fiction, selling in tens of millions of copies. Jo Nesbo, the Norwegian thriller writer, I think has sales of over 60 million copies. So the translation is actually going on various levels, not only on in terms of Nobel Prize winners, but also in terms of what André Lefebvre and I have called the non-academic reader, the non-professional reader. Everyone in this room can claim to be a professional reader, but there are lots and lots of non-professional readers too. But back to the question of translation history. A logical next stage in the development of translation studies was to focus on the figure of the translator. Who are these translators? Who are they? What do we know about them? Do we know anything? The visibility of translations was very much discussed through the 1990s, as of course were issues in relation to translation. We've already heard Umberto Eco quoted this morning by our chair, and we might think of Cronin's book on translation and identity, translation in the digital age, eco-translation, which took translation, the study and thinking about translation, a stage further. Cronin points out in eco-translation that he's referring to some of the vast planetary changes in communication over the last few years, and he has this to say. The digital may deliver information to the other side of the planet in seconds, but if the language is different, the virtual letters are dead letters. In a multilingual world, translation is the necessary companion of the global outreach of the virtual. And what the cases that Cronin was talking about is, of course, international relief agencies. And he was particularly affected by what happened during the great earthquake in Haiti a few years ago, when the actual rescue operation was hampered by the absence of translators. Translation has this enormously important role. But let me just take you back again to the 1970s, to the beginnings of translation studies, when translation studies was beginning. What was it? It was a little movement. It was challenging orthodox thinking in linguistics and literary studies. It was demanding a space for the study of translation. It was demanding a change in the status of translation and translators, because another thing that was pointed out and we've talked about a lot, translators are often very poorly paid. So in terms of improving the status of translators, if you pay translators little, it's unlikely that you're going to get very good translations. We wanted also to get more recognition of the role played by translation in cultural development, notably in literary history, rethinking national discourses and thinking about the role of translation. We also wanted to move beyond the emphasis on the European, because it was pointed out the invisibility, I'm using Veneti's terminology of invisibility, the invisibility of much writing from outside the Euro-American mainstream. And this is something that many African scholars, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for example, took up with great success. And we can see, if you look back through the whole history of the development of post-colonial studies, you will see, I'm sure you all know, many of you will know far better than I do, the importance here of rethinking the Anglo-American dominance in literary studies. But translation studies really began to grow in the 1990s. And I can again say this with confidence because I published my little book, Translation Studies, in 1980. And it was part of the series of books, the New Accent series that Terence Hawkes edited, that was trying to introduce new thinking about literary and cultural studies. And that book was reprinted in 1991. It didn't do very well in the 1980s. Not many people bought it. Unbelievably, it's gone through 4 editions. There will be a 5th edition coming shortly. And the book is more successful now than it was back in 1980, which I still find incredible. It is, if you like, first-hand evidence that translation studies and thinking about translation has gained in importance. Through the 1990s, over the last 30 years, we've seen publications, we've seen conferences, we've seen journals, we've seen events like this, we've seen publications like Ideas. And I think, it's interesting to think, why should this have happened? It certainly hasn't just happened because a small group of scholars got together and said we need to talk about translation. Something else has happened. And I have said in various essays that I've written, big political changes have epistemological consequences. We can see this happening in so many times if we look at the history of literature. The collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe led to the rise of vernacular languages and literatures. The Renaissance was an age that discovered ancient learning through translations. The Reformation, which divided Catholic and Protestant, was all about translation. The invention of printing in the West revolutionized the dissemination of information. The ideas that underpinned revolutions through the 19th century transformed the way in which the relationship between human beings and the divine and human beings and nature was seen. Romanticism was an artistic translation of political revolutionary ideas. We could go on and on. The Cultural Revolution in China, China opening up to the West, and so on. But in the 1990s, there were major planetary changes that took place. One of these, obviously, was the end of the Soviet Union, the China opening up to the West, the end of apartheid in South Africa, technologically, the arrival of the World Wide Web. One of the immediate effects of all of these changes was that millions more people began to travel. They traveled because, in a sense, they could travel. It became possible to travel, but they also, that is, they had passports for the first time. There was a developing tourist industry, a huge tourist industry that began to grow, cheap flights. Suddenly millions more people were in movement. And millions more people were not only in movement because of these changes that I've mentioned, but also millions more people began to move as a result of natural disasters, war, famine, persecution. So that today we have a completely different world than certainly when I was a student and when my academic career started. An enormously different world with different values, people moving in very different ways. And I think that all of this has raised awareness of translation understood in its broadest sense, not just as interlingual transfer, but also as intercultural transfer. And I think this is partly why, in the 1990s, we began to see these changes. Andre Lefebvre and I published a book in 1990, a collection of essays based on a conference like this that we organized, and it's entitled Translation, History and Culture. And we pointed out that one of our statements, translation basically is a form of rewriting, and translations, like all rewritings, are never innocent. There's always a context in which a translation takes place. There's always a history from which a text emerges, and there's always a context and a history into which a text is transposed. Translation, we said, involves so much more than the simple engagement of an individual with a bilingual dictionary. Indeed, the bilingual dictionary is itself an object lesson in the inadequacy of any concept of equivalence as linguistic sameness. How many readers, and I ask my students this all the time, are constantly frustrated as they endeavour to look up a word or a phrase in a bilingual dictionary, only to discover that the range of terms offered gives them a series of choices that they are ill-equipped to undertake. And if you want a good example of this, I suggest that you take a look at some of the translations that are on offer in the tourist industry. In hotels, in restaurants, menus is one of the most wonderful examples for students of inadequate translations where someone has looked something up in a bilingual dictionary and completely failed to choose the right term. What we were trying to say with that book and that conference is that different cultures are not simply groups of people who label the world different. Languages give us the possibility to shape our own views of the world, and languages are different from one another. We express what we see and feel through language, but because languages are so clearly culture-related, we often find that what we say in one language cannot be expressed in another, and this was my starting point when I referred back to my early childhood. This was something that, before I could articulate what it was, I could actually see that there were these differences. The English word, good example I use with my students, is the English word homesickness. If we translate that into Italian, it's translated as nostalgia. But then English has borrowed nostalgia, which in English then becomes nostalgia, pronounced differently but served in the same way, which isn't quite homesickness, it's a kind of longing. Homesickness and longing put together are almost, but not quite, the Portuguese saudade, which is an untranslatable term that describes a state of mind that's not really despair, but it's a state of mind. Angst, which is borrowed from German, is sort of sadness or regret, but it hovers somewhere between. We could go on and on with these. I mean, I owe thanks to the Czech novelist Milan Kundera for picking up on a number of these and pointing out that these are terms explaining emotional states of mind, which aren't strictly translatable. The early Bible translators, those of you who know the work of Eugene Nida, will know that the early Bible translators hit the whole problem of untranslatability and negotiation head on. How, Nida asked at one point, do you translate the image of the Lamb of God for a culture in which sheep don't exist? What exactly was the fruit that Eve was supposed to have picked in the Garden of Eden? What was the creature that swallowed Jonah? He was supposedly swallowed by a whale. But there aren't any whales in the Mediterranean in warm southern seas, and so on and so on. Faced with all these unsurmountable linguistic problems, what translators have done is to negotiate the boundaries and compromise. And I think the word compromise is important. Speakers of more than one language know this. You know that we are constantly having to compromise when we deal with the unfamiliar. The word democracy means different things in different countries. It's the same word, but it means different things. A word like bread has completely different social significance and appears physically different in different cultures, and yet it's a translatable term. When Gabriel Garcia Marquez was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, he started out with a story about Antonio Pigafetta, the Florentine navigator, who in his diary recorded all the marvelous creatures that he'd seen. But he had no words. He wrote, for example, he'd seen a monstrous creature with the head and ears of a mule, the body of a camel, the hooves of a deer, and the neigh of a horse. What was it? It was a llama. And the word llama had to be taken from the Peruvian language Quechua, because there was no word to describe this extraordinary animal. Now, I'm going to take now about another, I reckon I can do about another, if you're all up for it, I can do another roughly 10 to 15 minutes and then take some questions. Yes? Can I do that? Yeah?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
All right, good. I just wanted to be absolutely certain that I can just have this little bit longer so I can finish. Right. What I think became important in translation studies then, and the pathways that needed to be followed, were to continue researching into ways in which translations developed in different cultural contexts. What's the history of translation in different contexts? For example, I don't know, I've never had access to it, been able to read the history of translation in Bangladesh, and I think this would be a really interesting area. You may be PhD students already working on this, but I think the history of translation in different contexts is one important area. It's important also to move away from the Eurocentric models. I mean, I work in a range of languages, but all my languages are, I'm sorry to say, are European languages, ancient and modern. I don't have a non-European language. I think it's important also to look at what I'm calling the inter-traffic between cultures in terms of translation. What gets translated? Why? Why are, as Ibn Zohar said all those years ago, why are there times of immense translation activity and other times when there's very little translated? What is important? What's export? In the early 19th century, for example, we can see right across Europe, in Italian, Hungarian, Russian, German, the poetry of Lord Byron was extensively translated. Byron was seen then as a revolutionary poet. His work strongly affected the Russian poet Pushkin, the Czech poet Macha, and we can see that Byron had a major impact on the literatures in both those languages. Even today, when I have seminar groups with students from Greece or from Germany or from Italy, and I ask if anyone has read Byron, they virtually all read at least something of Byron. But if I ask the same of most English literature students within Britain, nobody's read any Byron at all. Byron has sort of sunk out of fashion and is no longer taught. These kinds of patterns, these movements are very interesting. And of course, I'm sure you all know that Shakespeare was regarded as a revolutionary playwright right across Europe, largely due to the translation of his history plays and of plays like Macbeth and Lear, which looked at issues of power. In other cases, we might point out that although in the Renaissance, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the three greatest Italian medieval writers, Dante, Petrarch and Boccaccio were translated. Indeed, Petrarch's sonnets transformed poetry in English. Dante had to wait until the 19th century. It's also the case when we think about translation that the status of texts that initially shock or surprise can be transformed. I would see this as a form of translation. When Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels came out in 1726, it was a savage satire of human expectations. Robinson Crusoe, another important sociological text. But then both of those today are regarded as children's literature. There has been a shift in how the texts are translated by cultural readers. I think we can summarize all of this by just saying that translation studies over the years has come to recognize the growing awareness of the complexity of translation. There has been some very significant thinking about this. The American comparative literature scholar Della Brodsky made some important points and argues that translation today needs to be understood as a politics as well as a poetics, an ethics as well as an aesthetics. I think that's an important quote. Translation is also broadening out at the moment. It is, we're used to be thinking of translation as an empirical linguistic maneuver, but actually translation involves, as I've been trying to argue, very much more. And yet, in 2019, Lawrence Venuti, one of the most significant translation scholars today, Lawrence Venuti published a polemic. He called it Contra-Instrumentalism, subtitled A Translation Polemic. And his view is that despite all the advances of translation studies, all the rethinking of the importance of translation, there are still some problems. What are the problems? Well, says Venuti, I mean, he tells us, he has, in his polemic, he says, stop doing this. He writes in capital letters, stop, S-T-O-P. So stop using terms like faithful and unfaithful, and recognize that equivalence between translation and origin is variable. Stop assuming that translation is substitution. Recognize it as a highly sophisticated mode of interpretation. Stop evaluating translations by comparing them to the source, because there's something different. Stop asserting that some texts are untranslatable. Every text is translatable, because every text can be interpreted. And stop treating translation as a metaphor. Recognize that translation is a material practice that is both linguistic and cultural. And what he's saying here, and we think, I remember he came to Glasgow and tried this out on my students, and everyone got very excited about it. And he was saying, stop. Because basically what I think Emerita is saying is that translation involves both the micro and the macro, both close reading and distant reading, and we cannot really separate these. Now, I'm going to conclude. I've been working lately on translating across time. I'm particularly interested in why there are certain texts that seem to continue to be translated across time. I'm fascinated by the emergence of a new field over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years called classical reception studies, in which scholar translators look back at some of the ancient foundation texts and reinterpret them because, and this is an important point in the European context, and particularly in the Anglophone context, whereas my generation still studied Latin and Greek. These are languages that have virtually disappeared. And so the whole question of who reads Homer and who can read Virgil and Catullus and the ancient Romans is now an interesting point. They can only read through translations. So, no translation, my basic message, no translation can ever be the same as its source text. But rather than seeing this as something that's lost, we need to see it as part of a process, part of an organic process. Once a translation enters the receiving culture, it sets off on a new path. Thinking back to the classics, Homer, the Iliad, began probably as an oral poem. But over the ages has become a source for writers, painters, creative artists across the world, and has moved to new life in new languages and new forms. But one of the things that I've been writing about is that some of the most recent translations focus on what the Iliad actually is about, which is the horrors of war. And rather than it being a poem, as previous generations saw it, as something that focused on the anger of Achilles and the relationship between Achilles and Hector, some of the newer translations and versions are looking at the horrors of war, because in the 21st century, one of the things that most appalls us, all of us, whether every time we switch on our televisions or hear anything, are the monstrous horrors of war. All texts, my final message then, all texts are available to us, but they all come through some sort of mediation. Jacques Derrida called this an inscription. The text has always been placed in some network of signification. And as I said right at the start, we all have our own individual, different mental encyclopedia. Our mental encyclopedia, as I said at the start, is something that we have constructed individually for ourselves, but it comes out of the context in which we operate. And I think I'm going to stop there. I hope what I've said has interested some of you, and I'm very happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions or comments or disagreements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very wonderful. downstairs audience have a lot of questions. And it's a shame that we could not have you here on the stage. Like, it would have been wonderful, right? So we could have crossed the ocean and come here, and reached our young audience. So I think I'll begin with a question that I had when we were talking about compromises when we do translation. But how about machine translation? This especially in this AI invaded or infested cultural milieu. So how do you negotiate the intervention of AI and machine translation?
This is something, honestly, I'm going to have to answer by saying I simply don't know. It's a scary prospect. We already have begun to, I think some of the polemics that I'm starting to see around this are suggesting that AI is going to have a much bigger impact, not so much on literary texts, but certainly in things like the tourist industry and so on. I mean, some of you may know I write a regular column a few times, 6 times a year for a bi-monthly periodical called the ITI Bulletin, which is the Bulletin for Translators and Interpreters. And one of the things I wrote about was, this might sound facetious, but I don't think it is, I wrote about getting a new car, and with a sat-nav that spoke to me. And it said very strange things in English. Every time it gave me a direction, it said, please, take the next left, please. And I thought, this is an extraordinarily polite sat-nav. Why is it doing this? Until a friend from Germany came to visit and said, oh, you've got a new car. And I said, yes. I said, it's an old Volkswagen. And so on. And he just burst out laughing. And he said, Susan, this is basically an AI or computer generated. It's a translation, but it's from the German. And of course, in German, we would say bitte all the time. So it's not wrong. It's just culturally different. And I had been driving along thinking, why is it so polite? I've never heard a guidance that does, and I think these are the kind of little hiccups between languages and cultures. And I think, one of the concerns I'm sure that we all have at the moment in the world is the controls over social media, and the absence of controls over social media, and the power of social media. And if we add AI into that mix, it is, something that I think is going to need a lot of thinking by a lot of people with more expertise and more power than I have. I'm sorry if that's an inadequate response, but I just don't know.
It makes sense. But one of the students had a similar question. So Sohan Sharif, and he's asking regarding ChatGPT and Copilot, that you mentioned translation as interpretation. So how do you think, who's interpreting, with ChatGPT or Copilot?
Absolutely. Who is interpreting? We've just had obviously we've just had the American elections, and I have read a lot and watched a lot, and here everything depends entirely on what appears. I think this is one of the issues. For many years, whenever I had a seminar of undergraduates, I would always get them to read one of this is before the advent of social media. I would always get them to read one of the English newspapers, particularly like The Sun, a very right-wing newspaper, hugely popular, selling in large quantities. My students would always start out by saying, we don't want to read this. Goodness, we don't want to read it. And I would say, yeah, but I want you to read it. And then I would ask, do you ever read it? Well, sometimes if I find it on a bus or whatever. And then I would show them taking it apart bit by bit. This was a newspaper that you could read from the front. It always had a sensational headline, but you could read it from the back where the sports pages were. And most people would read the sport and then read backwards. Now, the way in which the layout, the physical layout, the use of black on white, the use of photographs, the kinds of stories, all of this was very, very sophisticated. And yet, my students, who were all self-styled intellectuals, were being manipulated without actually realizing. And I think that this is why, if I were devising a new degree program for anyone, I would want to have something called critical thinking and how to read embedded in that. How to read. How do we deal with ChatGPT? How do we do? I think the need to understand, and this is where I talked before about the micro and the macro. I think we need to be able to really dig down and see in micro terms what's going on, because that will then shed light on the broader picture.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any other question from the audience? I think I'll ask another one. For those of us who translate here, this is almost a thankless job, and you're always guilty that you have failed to deliver as a translator. And if a writer does not get any literary award, it's a translator's fault. You agree?
Well, the translator, of course, has a responsibility. I mean, I've just done a small translation myself. 3 weeks ago, I translated a short one-act play by a distinguished Spanish writer. I can't say who it is because it hasn't yet come out, and it's coming out in something which is a first script for a colleague, so at the moment it's secret. And on the one hand, it was perfectly straightforward to translate, but then it wasn't. And the problem involved the actual terminology of theatre. It involved the stage directions. Not what people were saying, the dialogue was fine, it was the stage directions. And I began to realise here that, of course, this was one of the classic examples, like the ones I've just given, that things